Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and an impromptu live stream once again. I've had a few emails and messages, direct messages over the last few days about how to select books to read and what to study and how to make those decisions. And we're going to look at that today, mostly secondary sources today. So I will do another show in the future looking at primary sources, perhaps how to use archives, how to use and sift through that kind of official documentation. But today we're looking at secondary sources. Okay, so I'll put our things together. I stress right now, this is my opinion. This is what I think about things. You may think differently. My camera just did a funny thing with its focus there, but here's some advice from me, the host of World War II TV. So there are literally thousands of books available at any one time on World War II. And if you branch out into other areas of history, tens of thousands of titles. So one of the benefits we have these days with authors who are writing right now is that we can find out about them. You can see them on YouTube channels and podcasts and documentaries. They often have their websites. They may have a social media account. They have a blog. And it seems a bit odd, but if you're looking for an author to follow, to start getting into, and perhaps you're branching into a new area of history, perhaps the Pacific or the Eastern Front or something, have a look at the person writing the book, because I think you might be more attuned to someone who has similar values, similar outlook to you, and just the kind of person that you like. Okay, we've all done it. We've all sat and watched a documentary about a subject we like, and we've either just been put off by the presenter or their story because we don't like their style, their clothing, their hair, their voice, their mannerisms, their whatever it would be. I'm bored now. Or conversely, you're watching a documentary that you're not particularly interested in, but there's a really engaging person there talking about it, and you go, "What? No, what? This is really interesting." I'm thinking of Brian Cox, the astronomer, and how he talks about that. Or, I'm not really interested in that subject, but when he talks about it, I'm engaged. So my first bit of advice is, if you're looking for books, look at the person, do some research, look at who they are, look at whether they make you laugh, whether you hang off every word they say. Just do some research, and don't be afraid of thinking, you know what, I don't think this person is for me. There's plenty more fish in the sea. There's plenty more authors. So move on to someone else. So just my first bit of advice is just have a bit of background information about the author and their values and etc. etc. Second thing is, who is the book's audience? Who has the book been written for, when, and how? So we talk about it a lot on this channel about historiography. What was the purpose of the book? Is the purpose of the book to be a school textbook, to convey information to people learning? Is it meant to be the kind of book you take away on holiday and sit on the beach when you're sunning yourself? Is it a book aimed at people who already know about the subject? Is it aimed at a first-time reader about the subject? That's worth investigating too. And it's sometimes a bit difficult to work out whether the book is aimed at you or not, because you take someone who writes in series, someone like Prit Buttigieg, for example, who writes, I've got one of his books here because I'll be mentioning later on, Retribution. Do you need to have got some information about another battle before you pick up this one? Is it like one of the Star Wars films where you can watch it as a standalone, or do you have to have that knowledge of the previous films, the wider universe, so to speak? So that's worth checking out by just reading the blurb, reading what it says in the book. Again, maybe looking for some podcasts the author did, and what were the aims of the author? What audience was he trying to reach? Was he trying to reach young people? Was he trying to reach, or she trying to reach, an older audience? That's all worth looking at as well, I think. So I know this is rather vague, general advice, but we'll be getting some more specific advice a bit later on. And someone just said it there. Leslie just said it. The internet is the best resource. Don't be afraid. I can't stress this enough. Don't be afraid of starting with small books or just with Wikipedia. So let's say you're thinking of stepping into the Sino-Japanese War, for example, learning about that. There's no harm with starting with a small book. And I'm a World War II TV YouTuber. I suppose I'm a historian. I have to say, I've got quite a penchant for the Osprey book. This is the one on the siege of Budapest. I'm doing a talk on Budapest at We Have Ways in a couple of weeks' time. It's not very thick. Plenty of images, plenty of maps. You've got lots of, if you learn because you like visuals, the camera doesn't pick it up very well with the reflection. They're a good stepping point. Then there's this book that I've also been using, which is much thicker, and it's written by a Hungarian historian. But it's like, whatever it is, 400 odd pages. So there's different levels of information in those books there. So as I said there, with that bit of advice there, don't be afraid of starting off with something light. Start with an Osprey, start with a Wikipedia article, start with something minor, start with a YouTube broadcast or a podcast and say, okay, I'm not really sure whether I've got the time or the interest in tackling this new subject, let's say the Sino-Japanese War or the Finland War of 1940. So there's a bit of snobbery around books. There's a bit of, well, if it isn't 600 pages, it isn't a proper book. Well, that's nonsense. Okay. You can start with something smaller and then build to something later on. Confirmation bias, Veronica, is really interesting. We all do that. We all tend to look at things that confirm our own ideas about something, and that is a bit more of a complicated thing to address. And later on, I'll be asking the question of, what are you reading for? Are you reading for primarily entertainment, or are you reading because you want to learn? Are you reading because you want to be challenged? Because asking yourselves those questions is important. How much critical thinking and deep thinking do you want to do on a subject, or are you just reading because, I want to read about this and I want something fairly accessible? But yeah, don't feel you have to start with a 600 tome page 3-volume tome. You absolutely don't have to. This, I think, is the I drew that little graph on PowerPoint this morning: readability versus detail. Okay, so you have to decide where you want to go, because generally the more readable a book is, the less detail it will have, and the more detail it will have, the less readable it becomes. Now, by readable, I mean just whipping along, moving through it like you would a pot boiler on the beach when you're on holiday. And detail is that, who's that unit again? Which town was that? Was that the commander that was in charge of the different brigade earlier on? You're stopping and you're looking things up there. So if you've got prior knowledge on a subject, if, for example, you consider yourself something of a Normandy scholar, like Colin, who's there, obviously not working today, Colin, or you're having a break because your customer's in a museum, you think, well, I kind of know a little bit. I know about Normandy. I don't need to have the context of which ones are the British beaches, which ones are American. I know roughly where the geography is. So maybe a detailed book is going to be more appealing if you've got that base of knowledge about a subject. But if you're diving into something for the first time, you maybe want that more accessible, readable kind of thing. So, but there's always that trade-off. It's exactly the same thing. Yeah, you're right there, Colin. Some historians have a gift for narratives, and that's definitely something that you can have, the books that sit in that very small, often small area on the Venn diagram between readability and detail. People like John McManus does it. I think James Holland does it. Neil Barber definitely does it. You can do it both, but sometimes it tends to fall one way or the other. Some books, and no names, can be a bit too detail heavy. Well, Phil Nordyke, who I knew reasonably well, wrote about the 82nd Airborne. Very, very informative books, very useful books. I'm using them right now. There's one on my bookshelf because I'm using it to write my book on the 8th Corps in the Cotentin. But sometimes you just get bogged down with, who's that again? This lieutenant is who? What's it doing? Because you lose a bit of the flow with the detail. And then other people, maybe they're a little bit light on detail, but they're very readable. So, that's complicated. But essentially, you're going to have to kind of understand that there is this kind of graph there between accessibility and detail. And again, what is it you're looking to get out of something? The other next point I want to make is what do you want to know about in terms of analyzing a particular battle? What makes you want to read more? What makes you turn that page? How does the style and the way a book has been focused push you on to learning more. So some people very much like the kind of the squad level of what it's being like to be part of 10 men in an infantry company battling their way through Italy. So you got the personal memoirs of people like Donald Baguette or Eugene Sledge, or 18 Platoon by Sidney Jarry about the British, or Farley Mowat's writing about the Italy campaign from the Canadian point of view. So you don't necessarily feel the need to have that operational understanding of, so what's this division trying to do now? Which brigade is trying to cut off the pass there? And you can read both. On a Tuesday, you might want to read a squad detailed memoir of some guy who was in the thick of it, but gives you no context of what the generals are deciding behind the scenes. And then the next day, you might want to read that operational study that tells you, okay, so on day one, the division was trying to get to this line here. On day two, they were trying to reach the high ground here. And you can go back and forth between the different ones. And I might do a second show either today or sometime later about the fact that how you read is very indicative of how you learn and advice to give. So Colin, for example, who's watching, tends to do his reading during the day, right? I tend to do my research during the day. So if I'm reading to write something up, I tend to do that during the day. But my relaxation reading, I tend to do when I'm in bed and I'm finished off, but I'm not necessarily at that point trying to learn. So when I'm going to bed, often I'll be reading a book that I've read before, or it's a book about a subject I'm already quite conversant with, so I can say, okay, so I'll just read a bit about Stalingrad again. So when at the time of day you choose to read, I think can have an impact on what type of book you read and when you read it. But that, don't be afraid of identifying what it is you like about books. Do you like the oral histories? Do you like to hear about the people who are there? For example, Garrett Graff, who was on World War II TV on June the 6th, his oral history of World War II doesn't really talk about the operational and strategic level at all. It doesn't really tell you about exactly what tactics the British 3rd Division are using to push through from Sore Beach to Caen. It just puts you in the place of the men who are running through those beaches, running through those villages there, and that's fine. And yet another style of book, perhaps Peter Caddick Adams, Sand and Steel, will have more of a, and 3rd Brigade is trying to get through to there. So what is it that floats your boat? What is it that draws you in? How do you find yourself being drawn into a story? Will depend. So operational level, personal memoirs, they're all valid, but there are different styles of books. Next thing, and there's more variances than this, but do you want a pure military history book? Do you want a military history book that also covers the geopolitical situation, or the military, the political, and the social situation? So if you're juggling something like, let's talk about the Eastern Front, right? Now, I am firmly of the belief that you can't separate the Holocaust from the campaigning, but other people disagree. And some people, if they're wanting to read about a campaign, don't want to be distracted by being upset about the Holocaust. They want to devote a specific time to reading about the Holocaust and the massacres and the atrocities, and not kind of derail their understanding about a campaign by going off on a tangent. Some people want to have the two side by side. Some people want to understand what was happening globally while you're reading about a campaign. So John Parshall, he sent me information about his new book on 1944 that stands at something like 1 million words or something crazy that he's going to have to decide whether to boil it down to 3 volumes or whatever. But his book about 42 is going to take you across the globe at various times. So when you're reading about the Germans and Red Army in Stalingrad, he'll be reminding you of what was happening at the same time in the Mediterranean, and what was happening in the Balkans, or what was happening in the Pacific. He'll be keeping those plates spinning by reminding you about how logistics are being used. And that, for me, that's very appealing. But some of you out there might think, no, I literally just want to read about Stalingrad today. I want to read about what the problems were there, which units are being moved in and out, how the battlefield is shrinking or expanding, and they don't want that contextual side of things. Audio books, Grant, are very good as well. yeah, I mean, I've already got 2 books out, Leslie, so I'm technically already an author. But yeah, yes, there'll be a third one coming up next year. So yeah, I've published, and I've got quite a few articles out there, so technically I'm already an author. Audiobooks. I personally don't listen to audiobooks. No particular reason. I don't read Kindle and ebooks either. I like to have the book in my hand. That's just me. Okay. Um, yes, David, it can take months to get through Sand and Steel. That's the interesting thing. I mean, I so love Peter Adams. He's such a lovely, lovely guy. But you do feel when you get to the end of one of his books, you deserve some kind of medal for getting, because it's a, it's a real, it's a sacrifice of your time. It's a sacrifice of your learning, because you do have to kind of stop and think about things, because he brings in some kind of complicated themes and complicated issues. But at the end of it, it is probably the definitive book on D-Day, but not necessarily the book I would read when I'm sitting on a beach trying to just kind of chill out. I wouldn't read a Peter Adams at 11 o'clock at night when I'm trying to kind of get sleepy and go to bed. It would be keep me awake. I'd maybe read a Damian Lewis or Alex Kershaw or something. So that's very important, to understand how much of the war you want to allow into your head. The social aspect, and that's a wide-ranging area as well. I mean, you know, the civilian losses. I mean, in the First World War, I think only 7% of fatalities in the First World War were non-combatants, so civilians and other people. In World War II, it's 60%. So if you want to understand World War II, you absolutely have to consider that civilian non-combatant experience. So those who fell under the bombs in China and the Far East, and those that the populations of the countries like Yugoslavia and France and Belarus that were affected and murdered and deported and killed. That aspect is important. The political shenanigans behind the scenes, everything from sort of 1943 onwards, you've got to kind of accept the fact that the leaders are already thinking about the next phase. The leaders are already thinking about what we now know became the Cold War, and the breakup of India and Pakistan splitting, and civil wars in Greece and places like that, and the breaking up of the Yugoslavia years later. All that stuff was coming out of World War II while World War II was still being fought. So if you want to understand that aspect of things as well, that's another area to consider. Alan Allport, for example, takes you through the political side of things, and what were the the House of Parliament and the things. Now, for me, that's not the area I'm the most interested in. I'm not saying I'm not interested in it, but I will tend to focus on a book that is more about the military and social side of things than the political, unless the book is written really well. So going back to Alan Allport, for example, or Prit Bhutan. A Prit includes a lot of the political side of things in his books about the Eastern Front. So it's about how that reader, the writer, makes that subject accessible. But I know, kind of in my heart, so to speak, that the political side of things is less appealing than the pure military side of things. So that's my advice: is identify what it is you want to read about, and this is helping you theoretically kind of narrow down your choices, because there's a lot of stuff to read, as I said. Next point: new or old books, distance from the war versus recent studies. So again, if I could have drawn a graph on here. The books written during the war and just after the war have that directness of being by people who at the very least lived through the war, and quite often fought through the war. So I'm talking about now the books by the divisional commanders, the books and biographies by the Montgomerys and the Eisenhowers and the colonels who were here, and the German generals and the people who survived the death camps, those who were on the Bataan Death March, the pilots, the aircrew. And those books have that vivid connection because the guy or lady who wrote it, or if they're using multiple sources, lived through that event. And that can give you a directness and a sense of real proximity to that war, and an understanding of this is what that guy felt, okay, or that girl, that person, that family felt. However, you have to remember that the books written 70 and 80 years ago had less information than authors have today. They hadn't had the ability to get the archives that came out after the release of Ultra. They hadn't got the release of documents that came out from the various, MI5, MI6, and OSS and stuff in the decades after World War II. So The World at War, the seminal TV show in the 70s, didn't know about Ultra. It was just about to come out that. So some of the information about how decisions were made about where an invasion will take place or where an army group will move, we know now when based on information the Allies were getting from the decryption of the German codes, and therefore it gave the Allies that heads up as to this is the place to go, but they didn't know that back then. So a current author, someone like Prit Buttar, James Holland, Peter Caddick Adams, Alexandra Ritchie, Helen Fry, all these great authors, they did not live through the war. They may have spoken to people who lived through the war. They may have read the secondary sources of those who lived through the war, but they have distance from the war, which maybe lessens the veracity, the authenticity in terms of the voice from the war to the past, but they have more authenticity in terms of information. So that kind of dilemma that you face is, that a modern book will have access to more sources than an old book, pretty much. But the modern book will have that distance of being written 8 decades after the event it's talking about. So, again, what do you want? And my sincere advice is going to be to read a bit of everything, to read a bit of the books written just after the war and during the war. It's interesting reading some of the books that came out during the war, like Guadalcanal Diary by Richard Dragaskis. The outcome of the war was not yet known, and so that gives you something to understand. Guy Gibson's book that came out, he didn't know he was going to die. He didn't know the outcome of the war. That gives you an understanding of what people were thinking then before the outcome. Well, I said it on a show fairly recently. We have to remember sometimes to not include our knowledge of what happened next. So the Pacific, for example, all through sort of May, June, July 45, decisions are being made that we're thinking, well, that's an odd one, given that they dropped the atomic bomb in August, but they didn't know, the commanders on the ground, that the atomic bomb would be dropped in August. So you're adding information of your continuing of the story, your understanding what happened next. It's like, well, that's an odd decision, but sometimes it's important to remember that decisions were made at the time without that information. So distance from the war compared to modern books has an impact on the type of information required in them, okay, which comes down to kind of this whole understanding of how to examine secondary sources, how to look at information and pull out your own version of these things. My next point, let's bring up the slides again. Subject specialist or theme specialist. Now that is making me sound very intellectual. I just made this stuff up just after having a shower an hour ago. So the subject specialist, right? So that I would mean someone like, and I'll use the example again of Prit Buttar. Okay, so Prit Buttar is basically an Eastern Front guy. First World War and Second World War, but he's pretty much an Eastern Front, which in itself is a massively broad subject. But Prit would be the first to say that the Sino-Japanese War, the American carrier campaign, the British in Burma, that's not his area of specialist knowledge. So if you're looking for an author who's particularly renowned in an area, you will get that expertise on that area. Yet there are other authors who look at different battles, but through the lens of their own thematic understanding. So in the second category would be someone like James Holland or Saul David, who will leap from Burma to Malta to Italy to and to novels. James Holland and John McManus flits around the globe in his writing. Okay, his trilogy was about the Pacific, but he's also written about D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. He's written about Market Garden. So Neil Barber has really only written about British airborne and British commandos. Now, he's fantastic on those subjects, but if Neil Barber said, actually, I think I might bash out a book on Guadalcanal next year, Woody, I would buy it because Neil Barber's fantastic and really good at what he does. But I'd think, well, hang on, how much background can he his background to British Airborne is he's been studying it for 5 decades or something. So that's why he's got that legitimacy in that subject to go for the detail. Sol David's new latest book, Sky Warriors, about British Airborne, is in the style of the books he's looked at. Okinawa, he's looked at Wellington's supplies back in the Napoleonic era, he's looked at various other eras, and he will put the, if you like, the Sol David way of looking at war to his different subjects. Whereas Neil Barber puts his dedicated understanding of one particular subject to different volumes within that area of expertise. So I'll flash the slide up again. So subject specialist or theme specialist. So then this also connects with that point at the beginning about, do you happen to like the style of the particular author? Do you like the books of Ben McIntyre or Helen Fry or Alex Kershaw? Because Alex Kershaw, for example, is another person who goes from different subjects, different subjects. He's written about Italy, he's written about Normandy, he's written about submarines, he's written about different things, but he'll kind of approach it in the same Alex Kershaw way of, here, where's the story? How will I research this story? What story do I want to tell? Do I want to tell it from the point of view of one person or 20 people or 100 people? These are questions to ask yourself. So, and again, my advice would be a bit of both. Read a bit of everything. You can't learn about the British Airborne in Normandy without reading a Neil Barber. But maybe also read Sol David, because there may be a point Sol David makes because of his grasp of something on a more wider world that will add. Well, that's an interesting point. Add something to what you've taken away from Neil Barber's book, and then the detail you might get from Neil Barber's book, and that personal story from Neil Barber's book. So, keep on reading about the subjects you're interested in. Don't basically stop at one book. I've got a book on Warsaw in World War II now. I will stop now. Read another book. Look at the books that are referenced in the back of the book you've just read, and think, actually, I really enjoyed that. But also, don't feel that you have to go back to a subject. If you've read one book on the Battle of Warsaw and think, actually, I feel that was enough. I feel I'd like to branch out now. That's fine. It's okay to go, okay, I'm going to go off to read about the Sino-Japanese War now. You don't feel you have to stick in the same subject. It's not obligatory. Next thing, I cannot state this enough. Well, I've used expression, you've used expression, it's not a pile of shame. When people say, I've got these books yet, I haven't read them all yet, and they embarrassed in an embarrassed way, they say, I haven't read these books yet. Let's get that out of our heads right now, okay? There's nothing wrong. In fact, it's a positive is to have unread books in your house, okay? And to have not read every book that you've got. There was a point where I'd read all my books. I don't know. I'm no longer at that stage now. I'm basically hoping for a long retirement in good health and decent eyes where I can read all the books I've spent the last 20 years building up. I've got a couple of quotes here. This first one is by John Waters. If you go home with somebody and they don't have books, don't fuck them. I really like that. That's just, it's a bit old-fashioned in the sense that people can get their learning from YouTube or podcasts or audiobooks, but I just like the bluntness of that. He also said, collect books. If you don't plan on reading them right away, nothing is more important than an unread library. John Waters. He actually said having unread books is more important than having read books. And I've seen other people say that as well. And the second one by William Gladstone, books are delightful society. If you go into a room and find it full of books, even without taking them from the shelves, they seem to speak to you, to bid you welcome. Okay, so let's just get out of our heads the idea that having unread books is something to be embarrassed about. It absolutely isn't. I've got hundreds of unread books. Well, maybe not, certainly dozens of unread books. Okay, it just means it's a subject I haven't got to yet, but I know when I have the time, there is the book I want to read. There's the book. And it's still waiting for you. It's not going to go. It's not like a cake. It's not going to go out of date past its sell-by date. Well, technically the historiography could go out of date, but the actual content will not go out of date, okay? The shelf of opportunity. I like that, Leslie. It's a shelf of opportunity. So, yeah, I've used the expression pile of shame, but we should get out of that habit. Having books that you haven't read is just adventures you haven't been on yet. It's just things, it's like those maps with the scratch off things of the map of the world, where you scratch off each country as you go to it. There's way more countries I haven't been to than I have been to. I've got a little app on my phone of countries I've visited, and it's woeful. I mean, I've done about 20 or something, but it's not. There's plenty more I could be doing. Next thing, and I think this is actually the most important thing I want to say in this kind of mini stream really is what are you reading for? What are you reading for fun? And by fun, I don't necessarily mean to make you laugh. I mean for pleasure, because the art of reading is enjoyment. It's a relaxing thing. It takes away the pressures of the stresses of the day, etc., etc. I do read French, but slowly. I tend to only read French. I read French when I'm looking for stuff for research projects. I don't read French for fun because it's too difficult. It's too. I have to stop and go, what's that word mean? What's that sentence mean? Which is a very good point of asking that now, because again, what are you reading for? Why are you reading? If you're reading to learn, then you're going to want to you're back to that chart about readability and detail. Then the detail is what you're wanting. If you're wanting to read for fun, there's maybe a lighter book, and I've got some books out that I didn't actually end up showing you. For example, when I'm looking for an author, that point I made about who is the person, I'm not particularly interested in medieval periods, that kind. I'm not really, but I met a few years ago Dan Jones, who's on TV a lot, that handsome guy with the tattoos, and because I met Dan Jones and I liked what he said and I saw him speak, I bought his book, The Templars, about that. It's quite a hefty book, but it's very, very readable, and that's my single book. Actually, no, I've got the Crusades for Dummies book as well, but that's the book I read about that era, the Templars. And I want to just know a little bit about the background of you see carved Templar crosses and things on churches in Normandy. I just wanted to read a little bit about that whole Jerusalem kind of era. So that's the book I read. This is an example of the kind of book that it's not at all embarrassing to own. It doesn't have to be an 800-page book to be good. This is a thin little Osprey. Look, it's just a few pages. It's Tanks of D-Day, and it's by Steve Zaloga. You'll know Steve Zaloga. He's on the channel a lot. I have got other books on tanks, but this one is kind of just, if I want to read a book at the beginning of a tour season, or Colin was to say, would you remind me which tanks are on which beaches and which unit? That's a kind of a good, read it in an hour, and it's a good starting point. And similar this one here about the Falaise Pocket. Yves Bouteau wrote that one there. It's just, it's got some good maps, lots of photos. If that can be good. Or at the other end of the scale, you have something like that, which is Richard Frank's book in Guadalcanal, and it says on the cover there, the definitive account of the landmark battle. I would say since then there's been other books about Guadalcanal that have covered it in different ways, but yeah, it's an absolute amazing book. But some of you can look at that and go, no, too much. I don't care about Guadalcanal that much. It's an interesting one. This is a French, but in English language book about D-Day paratroopers. So if you kind of want to get into uniform and things like that, it goes through the, berets and cat badges and all that kind of stuff. With some, what were they carrying in their pockets, blah, blah, blah. And it's, it's whatever it is, 150 pages. This book, I don't think I've ever looked at a second time because it's too much detail. It's a book I bought, American Paratrooper Helmets. So it's just American Paratrooper helmets. Photos of each helmet, the different markings, different fit. It's very good. It's just I've never picked it up a second time because it has too much information in it for what I need generally. But it's there if I need to look something up. And there's nothing wrong with having books that end up becoming reference books, but you don't necessarily read them. Veronica, get in touch because I do want to eventually investigate doing more shows about Yugoslavia World War II, and so having people who can help translating that would be interesting. So that's kind of some general advice about Organizing data. Just quick that. Yeah, that's but everyone I know is bad at it. Even my bookshelves, I know where my books are, but I can't really explain how my system works to the people. Some of it's fairly obvious. There's a shelf of British Airborne, there's a shelf of American Infantry, but sometimes it's a bit confusing. Because what James Gavin's book is in with 82nd Airborne, not with the generals. But I could put it with the generals, for example. It's an arbitrary decision. In terms of archiving stuff in my hard drives, I'm terribly bad at it. I have files of things called American archives and British archives, and it's really haphazard. And I don't think now, with how little free time I have, I'll ever get to the point where I can really catalog all my my archives. What I'd like to see, I've talked to people about this over the years, is some kind of collective where historians, tour guides, we invest in some kind of space on the internet, and more importantly, some kind of indexing thing where if you upload documents to it, if I was to upload, for example, after action reports of the 812 tank destroyer unit, that the system would kind of OCR them and say, okay, this is a mention of the town of Cherbourg, this is a mention of that, and be able to index them so that it's not just indexed under the 812 tank destroyer, but it's indexed by place names that are mentioned, things like that. But that would be a system that would be very, very complicated to set up. But I would love to see a system where people like me who've got shitloads of stuff on their hard drives can put that information there for other people, and have it because it's accessible. But it's beyond my computer skills to get something like that set up. Where are the graphic novels that can be good for children? I mean, in what age children kind of comes into play there? I read a lot of graphic novels. I like graphic novels. Anything written by God, his name's gone out of my head now. God, I'm old. He wrote The Lion and the Eagle. I've had him on the channel. I can't remember what he's called now. Anything by him is fantastic. Garth Ennis. God, it comes back to me eventually. Is fantastic. He wrote The Lion and the Eagle about the Chindits campaign, is really good, but they're very graphic and very, lots of blood and lots of death and stuff. So they're for teens rather than kids. There's a lot of graphic novels in France, but translated into English because France has a massive, great bande dessinée (BD) culture. Even more so than Britain, and more so than America in some ways. They're massive on their graphic novels. More, maybe not more so than America, but it's massive thing in France. So there's lots and lots of D-Day. I mean, they're in the supermarkets here. They're in the supermarkets. There's like 20 in one series where you get like one about the Poles and the Falaise Gap, one about the Americans and the Falaise Gap. They've gone into some real level of detail. I haven't read them myself, those ones yet, just because I haven't. Yes, but many historians have the Excel proficiency of my ferret. Excel is one that if I have to open a document in Excel, I go, what the hell is this? I hate it. Finding stuff is really complicated. So I hope there's been some advice there that'll be useful to you. And I might do a second. Well, I will do a second one at some point about using primary sources. I might bring someone in to co-host with that because a trained academic historian might be better there. But I think ultimately, there's my kind of last words are: it's not a race. You're not under any obligation to learn about a subject at the same pace as someone else. If they've had 5 books on a subject, doesn't mean you have to have 5 books on a subject. If they've gone for a big fat book, doesn't mean you can't go for a thin book. If you don't like the historian they recommend because you don't like the way he or she writes, that's perfectly fine. Just it's your journey, it's your learning. And ultimately, as I said earlier, what are you reading for? Are you reading for enjoyment? Are you reading for learning, or both? And don't be upset if you are upset by reading books about the Holocaust. It's tough. Don't feel you have to keep diving into tragic subjects. Reading about the war can be upsetting, which is why sometimes just a kind of an autobiography of a Spitfire pilot where he's not necessarily seeing lots of people killed on the ground and it's all kind of aerial combat, that can be a lighter read than going into something about the Einsatzgruppen in Poland and talking about atrocities. You know, you can even within World War II, there are slightly more comfortable subjects to kind of delve into that aren't as hard hitting and aren't as complicated. So there we are. Just enjoy reading, and I will leave you again with that thing of do not be put off by having a pile of shame. It's just an adventure you haven't been on yet, and I hope maybe some of you got something out of this about deciding how to purchase your books, borrow your books. There's lots of decisions to be made, and some, but ultimately, you know, sometimes I just see a book and go, "Yep, I'll have that," and I don't give it any thought as to why I buy it. I have to say, because I used to be in the print trade and I learnt bookbinding, the first thing I do when I get a new book in the post is I give it a good old sniff. I love the smell of a fairly recently printed book. I love the smell of the ink on the page there. I love the feeling. I love the feeling of opening a book and kind of hearing that spine kind of bend open for the first time, and knowing that you're the first person to pull that book open, that particular copy of that book, and look at it there. So yeah, I like the actual physical attributes of a book as well. So there we are. We have the part 2 of our Battle of the Philippine Sea, or the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot book, with Seth from the Unauthorized History of the Pacific on later today. That's at 7 p.m. UK time. Tomorrow, Jonathan Dimbleby is on to talk about Endgame, his recent book on the final year of the war from the Soviet point of view. So talking about Bagration again. But there we are. Click, like, and subscribe. Buy the books of my guests, etc., etc. I will see you all again later on. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon. Cheers, everybody. Bye.